You do not know true silence until you are trapped 100 feet in the air above an ocean of dead pines. It is a heavy, suffocating emptiness that physically presses against your eardrums. My name is Elias. Watchtower 9 is nothing but a cramped 14 by 14 foot glass box. It sits precariously on 4 massive timber stilts driven deep into an unnamed ridge. The hardest part of the job is not the isolation. It is the unrelenting paranoia that comes when the sun goes down. At night, the complete absence of light turns the reinforced windows into perfect mirrors. You are just sitting in a glowing yellow cage, entirely exposed to whatever is wandering through the pitch-black valley below. The air at 7,000 feet is uncomfortably thin. Every breath tastes exactly like a dull copper penny resting on your tongue. On the afternoon of the 3rd day, a multi-day supercell storm rolled violently over the northern ridge. The sky bruised into a sickly, infected purple. Within minutes, a towering wall of charcoal black fog swallowed the entire valley. The temperature plummeted, and every time I exhaled, a thick plume of white vapor hung suspended in the freezing air. The rain began to lash against the glass like wet gravel. Then, the sky simply tore open. A blinding flash of white heat struck the primary communication array bolted directly to my roof. The concussive shock wave hit a fraction of a second later, rattling the teeth in my skull. The acidic stench of scorched copper and melting plastic immediately filled the cramped space. My long-wave radio let out a high-pitched squeal that quickly faded into a dead hiss. I lunged for the heavy plastic receiver and pressed the transmit button frantically. There was no static, just the hollow, dead hum of entirely fried circuitry. I was completely trapped in a swaying glass cage above a pitch-black abyss. The claustrophobia became a physical weight crushing down on my chest. I paced the narrow perimeter of the room, the old floorboards groaning under my boots. The suffocating smell of wet earth and impending rot slowly seeped in through the window frames. Around midnight, there was a momentary break in the storm. The dense black fog peeled back just enough to reveal the jagged silhouette of the opposing ridge miles across the deep valley. I pressed the freezing metal eyepieces of my field binoculars to my face. I slowly swept the distant ridge. Then my breath hitched. Sitting precariously on the very edge of a sheer cliff drop was a structure. I tightened my grip on the binoculars until my knuckles turned completely white. It was a dilapidated, rotting watchtower. The thick wooden support beams were severely warped, and the roof sagged heavily. I walked over to the back wall and dragged my index finger across the laminated topographical map. I traced the exact grid coordinates for the opposing ridge. The map in that section was blank. It was heavily marked as a designated dead zone. That rotting tower across the valley simply should not exist. A profound, agonizing paranoia began to pool in my gut. The silence in my cabin suddenly felt incredibly hostile, like the empty room was holding its breath. The need to hear another human voice became an overwhelming physical ache. I tore open the metal storage locker beneath my cot. I dug frantically until my hands brushed against the cold plastic of a dusty shortwave backup radio. It was an archaic, internal channel radio, powered by an independent battery bank. I hauled it onto the desk and twisted the thick analog power knob. A harsh, grating static hissed out of the speaker. It sounded like crushed glass scraping against sheet metal. I sat there in the dark, turning the tuning dial millimeter by millimeter. Desperate for any sign of a broadcast, I was just about to shut it off completely. Then, the static violently snapped. The white noise fell away entirely. A heavy, frantic sound of wet breathing broke through the speaker. Someone was hyperventilating directly into a microphone. I froze completely still. The metallic taste of pure adrenaline flooding my mouth. A man's voice, trembling so violently it distorted the audio, whispered through the receiver. "Thank God. Is someone there? Please. My name is David. I am a stranded hiker. I broke into the old rotting tower across the valley to survive the storm." His voice hitched into a suppressed, terrified sob. I pressed the transmit button and told him to stay calm, that he was safe. "No," he whispered, his breaths coming in ragged, wet gasps. I thought I was entirely alone out here. David paused to take a suffocating, shuddering breath. "I am looking down through the floorboards of my catwalk right now. Something unnaturally pale just crept out of the black pine trees. It is impossibly tall, hairless, and its limbs are twitching in erratic, unnatural spasms." The man on the radio began to openly weep. The wet sound of his panic scraped directly against my eardrums. "It just stopped moving," he choked out. "It is standing perfectly still at the bottom of my stairs." A heavy, agonizing pause filled the cabin as the wind screamed against my glass. "It has no eyes," David whispered, "but its entirely featureless face is tilting straight up at my trapdoor." The dead air hissed endlessly through the speaker of the shortwave radio. I sat entirely paralyzed at the metal desk. The heavy plastic receiver clamped so tightly in my sweating palm that my joints began to physically ache. My eyes strained intensely against the freezing rubber eyepieces of the binoculars. The wall of black fog rolling through the valley was completely impenetrable. A suffocating void that swallowed all ambient light. I was entirely blind. I was miles away from another living human being, suspended in a swaying glass box while the storm violently battered my fragile walls. Yet the wet, ragged sound of David hyperventilating over the radio frequency made it feel like he was standing right behind my chair. Every time he inhaled, a sickening rattle crackled through the static. The fear in his voice was not just typical panic. It was the deep, primal sound of a human mind rapidly decaying in real time. He was watching something that entirely broke his understanding of the natural world. "Tell me exactly what it is doing," I commanded, forcing my tone to remain as flat and clinical as possible to anchor him. A heavy, suffocating pause, dragged out for 30 agonizing seconds. The wind outside my cabin violently rattled the glass, threatening to drown out the radio entirely. "It is just standing at the edge of the tree line," David finally choked out. The audio distorted heavily as his hands violently shook the microphone. "Its skin looks like wet, gray clay. It does not have any clothes, and it does not have any facial features." David let out a suppressed, high-pitched whine that made my stomach physically drop. "It is just a smooth, pale dome where a face should be. But it is looking right up at me." The temperature inside my cabin felt like it plummeted 10 degrees in a single second. A profound nausea began to twist deep in the pit of my stomach. The air in my cramped room suddenly tasted entirely metallic and stale. The entity was standing at the base of his tower miles away, evaluating him in the pitch-black wilderness. "It is moving," David whispered, his words stumbling over each other in sheer terror. "It is creeping out of the pines." I squeezed the microphone, the cheap plastic groaning loudly under my grip. "Describe it," I demanded, desperate to keep him talking. "Keep talking to me, to just do not look away from it. Its arms are far too long for its body," David sobbed. "They hang down entirely past its knees, and there are too many joints." The speaker popped with a harsh burst of shortwave static. "It moves like a crushed insect, twitching and snapping its neck in these sudden, violent spasms." The horrific image burned itself into the front of my brain. I could not see it, but I could hear the sheer trauma fracturing David's sanity. "Step away from the window right now," I ordered, my voice dropping to a harsh whisper. "Lock the heavy iron deadbolt on your trap door and get under the desk." But David did not respond. The radio channel remained open, broadcasting the heavy, dead air. He had completely stopped speaking to me. A dull, rhythmic, thumping sound began to bleed through the speaker. David was holding his microphone directly against the freezing glass of his watchtower window. He wanted me to hear exactly what was happening on his outer catwalk. I pressed my ear closer to the glowing yellow dial of the radio. The acidic smell of overheated battery acid wafting off the casing. At first, it just sounded like the mechanical roar of the howling wind. Then, a thin, trembling sound pierced the static. It was a voice, but it was not the pale entity, and it was not David. It was the distinct, terrified weeping of a very young girl. The sound hit my chest like a physical sledgehammer. "Daddy, please let me in," the little girl begged. Her voice was high, tight, and suffocating on her own tears. "Daddy, it is so cold out here in the dark. My feet are freezing." The cadence of the crying was sickeningly flawless. It carried the exact, frantic desperation of a human child completely abandoned in the freezing rain. "That is my daughter," David whimpered into the radio. His resolve was entirely disintegrating. "That is Chloe. She is right outside the door," She must have followed me up the trail. I slammed my thumb down on the transmit button. I screamed into the receiver with every ounce of air in my lungs. Do not touch that door. She is not there. David, your daughter is hundreds of miles away in a warm bed. It is a trick. It is trying to get you to open the lock. Do not listen to it. But the weeping outside David's window only grew louder. The pitch and rhythm of the crying never wavered or paused to take a breath. It was a perfect, mechanical loop of pure human suffering. The entity began to audibly pound its wet, heavy fists against the metal trapdoor. Daddy, please. There are things out here in the dark. They are going to hurt me. The psychological torture was absolute. The heavy isolation of the Pacific Northwest wilderness pressed down on the roof of my cabin like a physical weight. I was physically chained to a desk in a glass box, forced to be nothing more than a helpless observer. My empathy was completely weaponized against me. Every human instinct screamed to help, to intervene. But I could do absolutely nothing but listen to the slaughter. David began to openly sob, the heavy dragging of his boots echoing over the frequency. I am sorry, I have to open it. I have to save her. Do not do it. Step back from the floorboards. The pounding continued. The little girl shrieked. The storm roared. My lungs burned with the thin altitude air. Then, the weeping abruptly stopped. The heavy thudding against the metal door ceased entirely. The sudden silence was infinitely more terrifying than the screaming. The radio channel hummed with deep, heavy dead air. David, I whispered blindly into the microphone. Are you there? Did you open the door? Talk to me. 30 excruciating seconds ticked by in total silence. The generator outside my cabin hummed a low, droning vibration. A high-pitched ringing began to echo deep inside my eardrums. Finally, the speaker cracked open, but the breathing on the other end was no longer erratic or panicked. It was slow. It was incredibly deep. It was perfectly measured. A smooth, inhumanly calm voice slipped through the static. It was smoothly shifting its pitch in real time. It deepened, then flattened, searching for the exact correct frequency. Within seconds, the voice perfectly replicated the precise tone, timbre, and raspy exhaustion of my own vocal cords. The unseen entity sounded exactly like me. My entire body locked into total paralysis. Hours ago, when I first arrived in this entirely empty, isolated cabin, I had cut my hand on a rusted metal drawer. I was entirely alone. The nearest human being was supposed to be 40 miles away at the base camp. I had mumbled a quiet, frustrated phrase to myself under my breath. Nobody could have possibly heard it. The glowing dial of the shortwave radio flickered in the absolute dark. The flawless, impossible copy of my own voice whispered directly through the speaker. God, this rotting place is going to be the death of me. The impossible copy of my own voice hung entirely suspended in the dead air. The phrase echoed off the freezing glass walls of my cramped cabin, bouncing back at me in the absolute dark. God, this rotting place is going to be the death of me. The sheer impossibility of it paralyzed my entire central nervous system. My blood felt incredibly thick and heavy in my veins, making every single heartbeat an agonizing, exhausting effort. A suffocating wave of pure terror radiated from the center of my chest up to the base of my skull. The shortwave radio hummed with a low, droning hiss, the glowing amber dial casting a sickly light over the metal desk. Then, the frequency violently crackled. The terrifying illusion of my own voice completely vanished, swallowed entirely by the mechanical white noise. It was replaced instantly by the wet, choking sound of David hyperventilating. His terrified panting tore through the static like torn sandpaper against bare skin. Elias, he choked out, the audio completely distorting from the sheer volume of his absolute panic. It stopped speaking. He whimpered. It is just standing perfectly still in the mud at the base of the tower. A massive surge of pure adrenaline forced the freezing air back into my collapsed lungs. I slammed my thumb down on the heavy plastic transmit button, my knuckles turning entirely pale under the pressure. Stay away from the glass, I demanded, my voice cracking heavily from the bone-dry altitude air. Do not let it see you moving inside the room. But David was entirely gone, completely swallowed by a profound psychological fracture. He pressed the microphone down hard against the wooden floorboards of his tower. He wanted me to hear the exact sound of his impending slaughter, to bear witness to his final moments. I was forced to sit entirely motionless in the dark, trapped in a swaying 14 by 14 foot cage. I pressed the heavy black plastic receiver hard against my left ear. The wind outside my glass walls roared with a hurricane force intensity. It slammed against the reinforced windows with the heavy concussive weight of wet concrete. But underneath the deafening storm, bleeding slowly through the shortwave frequency, was a sickening auditory nightmare. It was the heavy, methodical sound of the entity moving. The sound was not human footsteps. It was the erratic, scraping sound of wet meat dragging across dry pine boards. A slow, rhythmic vibration echoed directly through the speaker. Creak. A massive, heavy pause stretched out for 10 agonizing seconds. Creak. The entity had placed its massive foot on the lowest wooden stair. It was beginning the long ascent. There are exactly 140 exposed wooden steps leading up to an observation catwalk. It is a brutal, spiraling staircase, completely open to the elements in the sheer drop of the valley below. Every single heavy impact against the wooden boards sent a violent shudder straight down my spine. The sheer weight of the entity caused the ancient support beams to physically groan. It is massive, David whimpered. his voice dropping to an impossibly quiet, terrified whisper. It is dragging its elongated knuckles along the rusted metal railing. The metallic taste of pure fear instantly flooded the back of my throat. I was completely blind, staring out into an impenetrable void of heavy black fog. My only tether to reality was the excruciating crackle of the glowing amber radio dial. Creak, creak, creak. The heavy, agonizingly slow footsteps continued to climb upward. It was completely ignoring the hurricane force winds, trying to rip it off the exposed stairs. It knew exactly where David was. It knew he was trapped inside a sealed glass box entirely suspended in the sky. It knew there was absolutely nowhere left for him to run. The heavy, methodical creaking suddenly stopped. The silence that followed was heavy and completely suffocating. I strained my ears against the static until my eardrums throbbed with immense physical pressure. It had finally reached the exterior wooden landing. A deep, rhythmic sound began to slowly bleed through the speaker. It sounded like heavy, wet palms pressing against the metal trapdoor located directly beneath David's feet. "It is at the door," David sobbed. The sheer panic entirely destroying the clarity of the audio. "It is clawing at the metal hinges." The horrific sound of jagged, thick nails tearing violently into heavy iron echoed through my tiny cabin. The sound was frantic, entirely feral, and relentless. It was a machine of pure violence trying to rip open a sealed tin can. David began to shriek, a high-pitched, primal sound of a man entirely devoid of all hope. It is going to break through the deadbolt. I am holding the heavy iron handle, but it is incredibly strong. I squeezed my eyes shut, the freezing air searing my tear ducts as I gripped the edges of the desk. My jaw was completely locked tight. I was violently thrust into the horrific role of a completely helpless proxy observer. "Hold the door," I screamed into the microphone, my throat instantly tearing from the sheer volume. "Do not let go of the iron bar. David, push all of your body weight entirely against the heavy metal frame." The thick steel hinges of his trapdoor began to violently screech under the relentless exterior assault. The entity began to hurl its massive weight repeatedly against the metal plate. The dull, concussive thuds sounded like heavy bags of wet meat, violently impacting the wooden floorboards. The horrific sound of the tearing metal reached a deafening, impossible crescendo. Then, it abruptly ceased entirely. The sudden drop in audio felt like a physical vacuum violently opening inside my cramped room. A deep, agonizing silence immediately flooded the radio frequency. The only sound left was David's ragged, shuddering gasps for freezing air. "Elias," he whispered, his voice trembling so violently it caused the cheap plastic microphone to physically pop. It stopped pulling on the handle. It just let go of the door entirely. I sat perfectly rigid, my eyes fixed blindly on the completely black window pane in front of me. "What is it doing now?" I asked, the words feeling entirely like dry ash in my dry mouth. A 10-second pause felt like an entire, suffocating lifetime. David let out a breathless, highly terrified whine. The heavy wooden floorboards outside his window began to loudly creak again. "It is just walking around the exterior wooden catwalk." The sick, twisted tension in the air was completely and utterly unbearable. "It stopped at my front window," David whispered. The sheer horror in his voice escalated to an absolute fever pitch. "It is standing entirely upright, and it is slowly raising its multi-jointed arm." My stomach violently dropped, the deep nausea instantly returning in a massive wave. "Where is it pointing?" I demanded, slamming the heavy transmit button down. "Where is it looking?" David let out a heavy, suffocating sob that broke over the radio. "It is pointing straight out across the valley entirely," he cried. "Oh God. Elias, it is pointing directly at your tower at that exact millisecond." A deafening, concussive wave of thunder directly struck the granite ridge. The massive blast wave physically shook the thick glass walls of my tiny cabin. The old wooden support stilts violently groaned under the sheer concussive force of the impact. The local electrical transformer bolted beneath my floorboards exploded with a blinding flash of pure white heat. The entire local power grid instantly failed. The heavy hum of the internal generator completely died out. My cabin was violently plunged into absolute, impenetrable, pitch-black darkness. The concussive shockwave from the lightning strike entirely vaporized the local power transformer bolted beneath my floorboards. The heavy, mechanical hum of my electrical generator died in a single, terrifying instant. The sudden plunge into absolute darkness hit me with the physical force of a sledgehammer. The darkness at 7,000 feet in a wilderness storm is not just an absence of light. It is a heavy, physical weight that immediately presses down against your dilated pupils. The temperature inside the glass box plummeted instantly, freezing the condensation directly onto the inside of the window panes. The only light source left in the entire room was the sickly, radioactive green glow of the battery-powered shortwave radio. The tiny amber bulbs cast incredibly long, completely distorted shadows across the heavy metal desk. My ears immediately began to violently ring with a high-pitched whine to compensate for the sudden deafening silence. The acrid smell of scorched ozone mixed directly with the suffocating scent of pure metallic copper pooling in the back of my dry throat. I remained entirely frozen in my metal chair. The heavy rubber eyepieces of the binoculars still pressed violently against my face. I was staring blindly into the pitch-black abyss of the valley. My entire body was angled forward, leaving my back entirely exposed to the dark expanse of my own cramped cabin. Every primal survival instinct buried deep in my brain screamed at me to immediately turn around. My instincts begged me to check the heavy iron deadbolt on my own wooden trapdoor. But a heavy, paralyzing paranoia kept me entirely glued to the freezing front window pane. I was convinced that if I broke my intense focus on the valley, the pale entity would somehow instantly bridge the impossible gap. The absolute silence from David's microphone was entirely unbearable. Then, a deafening, highly concussive sound ripped entirely through the radio static. A horrific noise of thick, dry pine, violently splintering under immense mechanical pressure, echoed around my tiny black room. It sounded exactly like heavy timber being physically torn in half by raw, unnatural strength. A sharp, deeply muffled gasp of pure terror immediately followed the breaking wood. David let out a heavy, suffocating sob, the cheap microphone picking up the wet sound of tears directly hitting the floorboards. The heavy metal door completely broke. He whimpered, his voice devoid of any remaining sanity. The sheer finality of his terrified words hit me like a massive physical blow to my sternum. He was trapped inside the completely sealed room entirely with the massive pale entity. "It is completely inside the cabin," David whispered, the audio violently shaking as his trembling hands crushed the plastic receiver. A deep, freezing nausea violently flooded my entire digestive tract, turning my stomach into a heavy knot of lead. "Where exactly is it?" I whispered back, my voice barely registering above the violent howling wind. The radio crackled with a heavy, static-filled pause that felt like it lasted for several agonizing minutes. "No," David choked out, the sickening sound of his violently chattering teeth bleeding heavily into the broadcast. "It is just standing perfectly still in the very dark corner of the room by the metal lockers. It is entirely motionless, a towering, impossibly pale monstrosity lurking in the absolute dark, simply watching a terrified man bleed out his sanity. "Please," David sobbed, his wet, ragged breathing completely dominating the shortwave frequency. "Please just stay on the open line with me. Whatever you do, do not make a single sound." I sat entirely rigid, every single muscle fiber in my back pulling taut with pure proxy terror. I was utterly desperate to be his eyes in the pitch black. I frantically shifted my massive body weight forward in the metal chair, desperately trying to press the binoculars even closer against the freezing glass window pane. But as I leaned heavily against the wooden table, a massive, utterly catastrophic error occurred. My left elbow completely jerked backward across the smooth metal surface. It was a tiny, entirely uncoordinated movement, fueled strictly by massive physiological stress and exhaustion. My elbow slammed directly into the heavy metal side of my large insulated water thermos. The massive steel cylinder violently tipped sideways, plummeting straight off the flat edge of the desk. Time completely dilated, the heavy metal vessel falling in agonizingly slow motion toward the wooden floorboards. I threw my freezing hand out to grab it in the pitch-black void, but my fingers grasped entirely dead air. The heavy steel cylinder struck my hollow wooden floorboards with a deafening, massive physical thud. The violently sharp metallic sound echoed perfectly off my 4 thick glass walls. It instantly shattered the agonizing silence in my small, suffocating cabin. My entire respiratory system completely froze. The heavy air trapped inside my lungs instantly turning into solid ice. At the exact millisecond the heavy steel thermos violently impacted my wooden floor, the entire reality of the broadcast fractured. David's terrified. Wet sobbing on the radio cut out entirely. The shortwave frequency went completely and entirely dead. There was absolutely no slow fade of audio, no final scream, no desperate struggle. The completely unnatural stop in the audio was highly mechanical and instantaneous. My eyes widened in the absolute pitch black until my frozen tear ducts severely burned. The profound silence that followed the horrific metallic impact was physically agonizing. 1 completely excruciating second ticked by, then 2 seconds, then 3 entirely suffocating seconds of heavy and static, filled dead air. I held my breath completely, desperately waiting for the wet sound of David's panic to return. But the stranded hiker never spoke another word. Instead, the radioactive green dial of the radio flickered brightly in the massive dark. The harsh white noise of the static gently parted. A sickeningly calm, perfectly smooth, completely inhuman voice whispered directly through the speaker. The cadence was entirely flat, entirely devoid of any panic or fear or human emotion. The pristine audio delivered 5 impossible words directly into the dead air. I just heard something drop. The 5 impossible words hung entirely suspended in the freezing air of my pitch-black cabin. I just heard something drop, the perfectly smooth, utterly inhuman voice sliced completely through the heavy layer of mechanical white noise. My entire physiological system suffered an immediate, catastrophic shock. My frozen lungs entirely refused to draw in any oxygen. The heavy, metallic air violently burned the back of my dry throat like swallowed ash. A deep, agonizing paralysis locked my spine perfectly straight against the rigid back of the metal chair. The completely flawless copy of my own exhausted voice echoing from the cheap plastic speaker entirely shattered my fundamental grasp on reality. The sheer horror was not just the highly impossible auditory mimicry. It was the terrifying, profound intimacy of the clinical statement. The heavy steel thermos had plummeted to my hollow wooden floorboards, entirely in absolute silence inside the cabin. The dull metallic impact was completely muffled by the roaring hurricane winds, violently battering the outside of my glass walls. The precise sound of that heavy cylinder striking the floor could absolutely not be heard miles across a heavily forested valley during a violent supercell storm. A completely blinding, massive fork of pure white lightning violently struck the granite ridge directly above the deep valley. For one single, utterly terrifying millisecond, the entire sprawling forest was illuminated in a stark, completely sterile white light. I was completely hyper-fixated in a state of absolute proxy terror. My watering eyes were still violently straining through the freezing rubber eyepieces of the field binoculars. The sudden, explosive flash of lightning perfectly illuminated the exact coordinates of the dilapidated tower across the massive gorge. The horrific, absolute truth was instantly burned deep into my retinas. The unmapped watchtower sitting precariously on the cliff edge had absolutely no roof structure remaining. The thick glass windows were entirely shattered, leaving nothing but jagged edges of black glass jutting from the heavy, rotting wood. The spiraling 140 wooden stairs had completely collapsed into a pile of splintered pine decades ago. It was nothing but a rotting, entirely empty skeleton standing blindly in the endless dead pines. There was absolutely no terrified man named David. There was no stranded hiker desperately seeking shelter from the brutal storm. There was no trapped father weeping violently over the radio for a lost daughter. The heavy, suffocating, dead weight of pure realization hit my chest with the physical, concussive force of a massive freight train. My violently trembling eyes slowly rolled down, pulling completely away from the heavy binocular lenses. I locked my vision onto the glowing, radioactive green dial of the shortwave radio resting on the desk. The heavy, mechanical paranoia finally pieced the terrifying puzzle completely together in my fractured mind. The thick analog knob on the backup radio was deliberately locked entirely onto an ultra-short-range internal frequency. The archaic analog hardware was physically incapable of broadcasting or receiving a signal from more than 50 total feet away. The impossibly tall, pale entity never crossed the miles of pitch-black wilderness. It never climbed the heavy wooden stairs of a distant watchtower. It never violently clawed at an opposing metal trapdoor. The entirely fabricated audio was never a desperate human cry for survival. The massive pale entity completely weaponized my inherent, deeply human desperation for a single thread of connection. It meticulously created a perfectly engineered, highly intricate auditory trap over a stolen emergency walkie-talkie. The heavy sobbing and the violent scratching broadcast over the speaker were entirely designed for one single, horrifying purpose. It kept my entire body completely glued to the heavy metal desk. It kept my terrified eyes staring blindly out the freezing front window pane for hours on end. It kept my back entirely turned away from the pitch-black expanse of my own cramped cabin. The violent hurricane winds pounding the glass perfectly masked the heavy, erratic creaking of the wet wooden stairs leading directly up to my own exterior catwalk. The endless howling storm entirely drowned out the quiet, methodical sound of the entity picking the heavy iron deadbolt on my own wooden trapdoor. The glowing amber bulb on the shortwave radio abruptly clicked off with a harsh mechanical snap. The heavy hum of the internal battery completely died out. The cramped 14 by 14 foot room was immediately swallowed by a suffocating, impenetrable, dark void. The sudden silence inside the cabin became a physical pressure crushing down on my eardrums. I slowly, agonizingly lowered the heavy rubber binoculars completely away from my face. My hands fell entirely dead against the metal desk. The immense stench of damp earth and rotting copper instantly flooded my nasal cavity. It was a distinctly physical odor, radiating directly from the dark corner of my cramped cabin. A secondary, completely silent flash of sheet lightning briefly shattered the dark sky directly behind my tower. The sudden blast of bright light vividly reflected perfectly across the freezing glass of my front window pane. The thick glass acted as a flawless, high-definition mirror against the heavy dark, illuminated entirely in the sharp reflection. Standing absolutely motionless in the cramped space directly behind my chair was the pale entity. It had been inside my tiny glass box the entire week. The impossibly tall, completely hairless monstrosity was standing mere inches behind my left shoulder. Its wet skin was the sickly, rotting color of entirely dead gray clay. Its heavily elongated, multi-jointed fingers gently gripped a heavy yellow plastic emergency walkie-talkie. It possessed absolutely no eyes to see with, but its completely featureless face possessed a massive, highly unnatural smile. The entity slowly raised a single, impossibly long white finger up to its perpetually smiling, completely lipless face. "Shh," it whispered smoothly into the dead air. The entirely flawless mimicry of my exact exhausted voice scraped directly against my freezing eardrums. The massive drop in ambient room temperature was absolutely immediate. There was absolutely no time to reach the heavy metal locker beneath the cot. There was absolutely no time to even pivot my rigid body around in the small metal chair. The audio violently cuts to the heavy, sickeningly wet sound of a massive jaw rapidly unhinging in the dark. A single, deeply choked gasp of pure biological terror is violently cut entirely short by the deafening crunch of thick cervical bone snapping in half. The heavy, horrific tearing of soft tissue completely drowns out the ambient howling of the storm. The desperate screaming absolutely does not last for very long. There is completely no heroic struggle to survive. There is no frantic escape out onto the wooden catwalk. There is absolutely no rescue coming from the base camp to save me. The recorded audio ends with 2 entirely unbroken minutes of a completely black screen. The only sound left in the world is the cold, indifferent, relentless howling of the Pacific Northwest storm, violently battering a completely empty glass box. Just the wind.